If you didn't believe in the world of demons and spirits before this moment, you should hear this story. Death and madness of two couples due to curiosity in the forbidden area. Join me to tell their scary story. If you are interested in horror stories, don't miss this video. Keep in mind that you may need scary reasons and violent scenes to watch this video. Ryan and Sarah, two teenage friends, step into a scary story ahead. They had heard about the legends about the haunted mansion of Winchester. According to the news, there were haunting files in this mansion that contained stories of ghosts, and anyone who went there would encounter goblins. Courageous and surprised, Ryan and Sarah decide to investigate Winchester. The two of them travel to an isolated city near the mansion and move towards their destination with fear and excitement. When they reach the mansion, there is a deep and terrible darkness ahead of them. Inside the mansion, the cold and breathless air envelops them. The upper passages are dimly lit, and the world's longest unbroken belt curves between the doors and the rooms. When Ryan and Sarah enter the dark and mysterious rooms, they hear strange sounds. At the edge of one of the rooms, Ryan accidentally finds a strange file. The file contains pictures and a description of ghosts and goblins who live in the mansion according to local beliefs. These images and descriptions are depicted using dark and intense colors and create a heart-wrenching sense of fear in the hearts of Ryan and Sarah. As the darkness and filth became more colorful, Ryan and Sarah came close to chaos. Unpleasant and superstitious sounds came from their right and left shadows. Goblins advance and drag them to themselves. The fight against these dark forces begins for Ryan and Sarah. Will Ryan and Sarah manage to escape the real-life ghosts, or will they be possessed by goblins and linked to haunting files? Their lives go hand in hand with a terrifying and passionate battle with ghosts in the haunted Winchester mansion. It was Friday and the sun was setting, the same time when Ryan and Sarah were sitting in a dark room. Their hands shook violently and they woke up among many and looked at the two of them. Strange and clear sounds came from every direction, and also the curtains glowed amazingly. With a gasp, Ryan and Sarah grabbed each other's arms and walked out of the room for some reason. The royal light shone from their eyes in a dazzling moonlight and shook their souls. The invisible corpses of the goblins were gathered around them, and their terrifying voices shook their ears. They had left the half-darkness of the room. The instructive looks of the goblins had penetrated their entire being and made them step in the face of great danger. A sound similar to polite laughter shook their ears and was interrupted like a sad song in the sky. Ryan and Sarah walked towards the exit with a dazed balance. Angry and dark goblins appeared from the same undergrounds that were stretched to the end of the corridor, each with a power that destroys any normal person. These goblins attacked Ryan and Sarah with loyal rhythmic movements. Their balance was compromised and every blow they received was painful and powerful. The two young men followed a fierce battle with the goblins until they were out of breath. Will Ryan and Sarah be able to defeat these dark goblins and escape? Or will they attract the dark forces of the Winchester mansion forever and stay there? The fight between the teenage couple and the increasingly terrifying and stressful ogres continues in the haunted Winchester mansion. Ever since Ryan and Sarah got involved in the battle with the goblins, that dark and mysterious mansion was made up of troublesome mirrors and endlessly complicated corridors. All the stunning edges and sequences around them were visible, hinting at the fear and awe of the monsters that had united with the goblins. With the terrible sound that shook their souls, they walked forward in impressive silence. Every moment these steps plunged into a mysterious illusion, transporting them towards dark and unknown centers. Half-open curtains and doors fell in their sight and the bomb exploded their minds. Ryan and Sarah were huddled in a curtained room and kept encountering goblins. The arms of the goblins grew to an unimaginable strength, and a couple of them were patient. Moment by moment, the goblins gained control over Ryan and Sarah with their terrifying movements. They made them tremble and filled with anger and fear. Every time Ryan and Sarah fell into the trap of the goblins, the rooms and corridors were transformed and murky. The walls were changing shape, changing their length and width and dominating them at every angle. The house surrounds them in a form of obsession and concern, and a nightmare comes to life. From the sad windows of the mansion, wild hands reached out and reached for Ryan and Sarah. The corridors were bleeding and unpleasant noises were coming from all corners. Darkness and fear reigned in the air, and every movement raised their fears. Can Ryan and Sarah escape the clutches of these angry men roaming the mansion? Or will a storm of terror and darkness engulf them forever and keep them in an endless nightmare? Ryan and Sarah's fateful and terrifying battle with terrifying monsters continues in the dark and evil rooms of the Winchester mansion. With trembling and furious steps, the goblins charged towards Ryan. The sound of lifeless screams rose from the heart of the darkness, and fierce and violent hands reached out to him. Ryan was struggling in a turmoil of panic, but suddenly, after a fatal blow, he broke away from the goblin and fell to the ground. The sound of strong shaking arose in the sad silence and penetrated into Sarah's being. He left the room with anger and a sense of restlessness in search of answers and solutions. He wanted the most deserved revenge of his dear friend's blood. Sarah moved through the different corridors of the mansion with the chaser rising. It was dark and silent around him, except for the dim lights from the scattered wall lights, which suddenly turned off and plunged everything into darkness. Heavy footsteps were heard in the distance. Sarah is moving faster, but the goblins continue to advance. Their hands bled the farmers, and they reshaped the knobs and walls to their advantage. Sarah's grenade scream reached her surrender. With her conscience destroyed and her vision calm, Sarah is trapped in a curtained room and finds solace in her arms. But upon opening the curtain, the dark and evil eyes of a goblin dragged him to another unreality. In the least breath that Sarah took, she sent her cries of hopelessness to the outside world. He decided to end his last hope of leaving this world in battle and free himself from the darkness of the Winchester mansion forever. Will Sarah be able to find a way out? Can she betray Ryan and try to save herself? Sarah's journey continues into a land of overwhelming and terrifying darkness to survive and take revenge. Still in the darkness and terror of the Winchester mansion, Sarah walked with trembling hands and a heart full of fear. His days and nights had turned into a sad and terrified life. He went from room to room, checking every nook and cranny, but there was no way out. With a sudden movement, the first goblin's arms reached out from behind the curtains and pulled Sarah to them. Their quarrel began. They pulled the sky curtains full of blackness over Sarah's face and plunged her into the depths of darkness. In the basement of the mansion, Sarah was placed in an abandoned Kenji. The hands of the goblins were twisting and their surroundings appeared in unstructured synchronicity. The wildest dreams and most terrifying nightmares will soon find their way into Sarah's mind. Sarah is surrounded, but still searching for a way to survive. He was lost in a network of dark and complicated corridors. Everywhere she went, walls changed shape, doors and windows closed, leaving Sarah in the midst of dangers and monsters. A distant voice heard Sarah's scream. He rushed towards it with a last hope. As he moved towards the sound, a light suddenly flashed from the corridors and frightening hands emerged from the shadows. Sarah became wild with a momentary irritation of the toy of these hands and hit the door. With a shudder, the door swung open and Sarah entered a strange world. Time and space were mixed together and the mansion had become an extraterrestrial from his point of view. Amidst sudden flashes and springs of light, Sarah stood on top of a small hill and the dark sky engulfed her. Can Sarah escape from this mysterious and dangerous world? Or has he faced a new peace and paradise? His journey will continue in this terrible land. Sarah realized that in this dark and terrifying land, there was no turning back. He was surrounded, and suddenly, In the midst of the darkness, a terrifying monster with glowing eyes and bloody hands approached him. This gleam deceived Sarah's eyes. The goblin was in front of him and there was no hope left for salvation. A burst of passionate madness rose up inside Sarah. It had no sensitivity to space and time, it was content only to be haunted by horror. He laughed at his hands and looked around with a confused, evil smile. The goblins penetrated Sarah's language with their tongues, but she didn't actually make the ground to communicate with them. Sarah knew this advantage well. He kept up with the goblins, overwhelmed by his increased powers, and communication beyond normal boundaries became more apparent. A sense of complete madness filled Sarah Morocco. He couldn't figure out where it ended and where it began. The goblins fell upon him as an alluring and powerful force and swept him into their arms. It's an all-alcoholic entry into madness. Sarah experienced a sense of penetration into the blood as well as all the minds and souls of the goblins. He was completely engulfed in darkness and could no longer distinguish between good and evil. This madness had penetrated deep into him like an electric wave, and every sign of humanity had been robbed from him. Sarah was no longer human among the goblins. He had become an element of evil. There was no opportunity to return to rationality. He was now one of the monsters he was becoming. Chasing hunts, immeasurable fun and preparation for any terror and destruction, had taken away from Sarah's personality.